With so much going on astrologically right now, I figured this would be an awesome time for us to have a discussion about the planets, astrology, and how they affect us as modern mystics. I'm excited about this podcast today because I'm covering a ton of things that I am hoping will bring you much light and joy for the next new year. Welcome to the Modern Mystics Podcast. I'm your host, Alana Kaivalya, the Yoga Doctor. I'm here to help you realize your potential as a spiritual leader and elevate your work in the realm of yoga, mysticism, and spirituality. This podcast covers all of our favorite topics: yoga, alchemy, astrology, divination, spirituality, psychology, ritual, and mystical practices both ancient and modern. Get ready to up-level your status as a modern mystic. What do the planets have to do with it? This podcast is all about astrology for the modern mystic. So let me just do a quick recap of what a modern mystic is, since we are newly rebooting this podcast, and it's a term that you perhaps have heard before. A modern mystic is someone who exists now and today, which I'm hoping is you. And a mystic is one who brings together certain spiritual tools for personal spiritual upliftment. I know that sounds broad and cliche, so let me break it down for you a bit. Mystics have been around for thousands of years, and mystics generally are the inward turning arm of any spiritual or religious practice. So here's what I mean by that. In most every religion, practitioners pray or focus outward toward an external source of inspiration or deity. A mystic focuses inward on the internal source or the essence of that same deity. So in Christianity, Gnosticism is its form of mysticism. In Islam, Sufism is its form of mysticism. In Judaism, the Kabbalah is the mystical practice. And in Hinduism, yoga is the mystical practice. So mystics have existed for a very long time. And in many cultures throughout history, there was something called mystery schools, where spiritual practitioners would go to learn the spiritual practices of the day to help their students, clients, people celebrate holidays, go through different life transformations or transitions, provide counseling or inspiration, or answer deep questions. And that's what mystics did. And mystics were always trained in many different types of modalities, not just one. So it wouldn't be enough for a mystic to simply know a physical practice like asana. A mystic needs to know how to heal a person's body, mind, and spirit from the inside out in a different way than, let's say, a medical doctor would, or let's say a psychologist or psychiatrist would. Mystics have access to different tools, and that's what you and I do. We access things like yoga, alchemy, divination, psychology, ritual, and astrology in order to help people in the here and now. So this is the journey that you and I are on as modern mystics as we work to step into our role as spiritual leaders. Spiritual leadership is so necessary today. And the reason that I know that is because of the kind of questions that your students and clients are asking you. They're likely asking you about their relationship, about what to do about their job, how to find their highest purpose, how to integrate this piece of philosophy. They're more likely asking you for support and advice about the big things in their life than they're asking you how to stretch their hamstrings further. So those kinds of questions clue you in to the bigger role you're being called to do, which is spiritual leadership. So, spiritual leadership requires you to step most fully into mysticism as much as you possibly can, and that's what you and I do here on this podcast. So, with that little bit of question answered, we're going to dive a little more deeply into astrology and give you a quick and uplifting overview on how the planets in astrology work. There are, in fact, 10 planets in the astrological system. I know that in the astronomical system, there are 9 planets, but in the astrological system, we use the older Greek translation of the word planet. So the word planet originally meant wanderer. So anything that wanders around in the sky according to our own perception. And since we're on Earth, we can't perceive Earth in the sky. So astrologically speaking, Earth is not necessarily a planet. We know that it is. We're standing on this rock. But astrologically speaking, Earth is the planet that we're standing on, and we look at all of the other planets in the sky, and there are 10. There are 10 wanderers. We also include the sun as a planet because from our perspective here on Earth, it does wander in the sky. And even though the sun, of course, is a star, in astrology, we call it a planet. So bear with me on that, and trust me, those differences make a huge difference to me and mean a lot to me. I actually have an undergraduate degree in physics and astronomy, so I did study the astronomical side of things, and I have a very dear friend who was my astronomy professor, and she's kind of a big deal in the astronomy world. She is the curator at the Griffith Observatory out in LA. And interestingly enough, she is also one of my favorite people to discuss astrology with. So she's quite an amazing human being and was an amazing introduction to both the practices of astronomy and astrology. So all that said, I have a deep love and respect for both, and I will try to be as clear as I can with my descriptions and distinctions as we go through this podcast. All right, so our 10 planets in the astrological system are the Sun, the Moon, Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. Just to be clear, yes, Pluto is a planet. Damn it. You cannot tell me otherwise, either astrologically or astronomically speaking. So those are the 10 planets that I'm going to run through today. And one of the things that I want us to keep in mind as I run through them is their importance for us as mystics. Okay, yes, there are planets in the sky, and we have all heard of astrology. But what they mean for us as mystics is not that those planets, those bodies, those big gaseous giants out there in space, they are not doing anything to us. Okay, Jupiter, the actual planet with the great red spot, does not care what our day is like. Jupiter is not invested as to whether or not we are learning astrology. That planet has no cares about it at all. What Jupiter represents is a force inside of us, okay, what we call an archetype. So archetype is a psychological term. So remember how as mystics we like to integrate lots of different practices? Psychology is one of the practices that we integrate. And handy enough, astrology is psychology. Astrology gives us the ability to look under the hood of our psyche and see what's actually going on. All of us are unique and special snowflakes, and there are good reasons why for that. And just as psychology is a soft science based on predictions that have been observed and repeated over time, so is astrology. It is a soft science based on predictions that have been observed and repeated over time. Astrologers have noticed that when planets are doing certain things in the sky, people on Earth are also doing certain things, and those became more and more predictable over time. So once again, it's not that Jupiter, the gaseous planet, has any interest in what we are actually doing or any influence over us. It's that Jupiter's position in the sky is predictive of some kind of internal behavior that will come out of us. There is a Jupiter inside of us. Let's think of it that way. For the mystic, everything is on the inside. So when I talk about Jupiter, when we're looking at Jupiter, we're not looking at the gaseous planet. We're looking at the element that Jupiter represents, the archetypal truth within us that Jupiter represents. And I don't mean to keep harping on Jupiter. It could be the Sun, the Moon, Venus, Mercury, Mars, any of them. They are the elemental archetypal realities within us. And because human beings, yes, I know, we're all unique and special snowflakes, we are actually not as unique and special as we think we are. And as human beings, we all have very similar archetypal realities. For example, as human beings, we will all have parents. They may not be around. They may have been two around. They may have done a wonderful job. They may have done a not so wonderful job. It doesn't matter. What matters is that as human beings, one of our archetypal realities is that we all have a family. We all have parents. Another archetypal reality is that we all communicate. Another archetypal reality is that we all have an ego. Again, it might be a really strong one. It might be a fairly weak and shy one, but it is there. And those realities are expressed beautifully by the planets. So one interpretation of how astrology works, again, is not that the planets are exerting any force on us, but you can think of them rather as the hands of an old school analog clock. And when the minute hand points to a certain number and when the second hand points to a certain number, that is not time. Those are simply representative of time. And when you see, let's say, that the hands point at 4 and then the 6, that it's 4:30, you know that it's going to be getting dark outside, especially this time of year for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere. Again, the hands on the clock are not determining the fact that it is dark outside. They are simply telling you that it is dark outside. And that's how the planets work. As they move around, they tell us that certain energies are alive within us. And they actually tell us with some great degree of predictability. All right, so now that we've gone through a little bit of Astrology 101 and we've discussed the 10 planets, including Pluto and, oddly, the Sun, we want to talk first about the personal planets, okay? Because these represent you, who you are. They embody your personality, your fundamental qualities, and our basic drives as humans. The personal planets are what make us tick. And remember, for the purposes of this discussion, we're talking about all of the archetypal elements of the planets within you. So let's talk about the first two, and in my mind, probably the most important, the Sun and the Moon. The Sun represents our ego, or our conscious mind, and the Moon represents the unconscious mind. So these are what we call the luminaries. They are self-luminous. They are brightly shining bodies in the sky. The Sun is our light, and the Moon is our shadow. For the purposes of our personality, the Sun runs the show. The Sun gets to come out and play. The Sun is often how people describe you, how people interface with you, the immediate way in which you present yourself to people. The Sun is your first impression to the world. So when you name your sun sign to someone, you're telling them that in a general way, this is how your ego presents itself. It presents itself, let's say, as a Leo. So perhaps in a social setting, you're fairly outgoing and you like to make people laugh. Or if you tell people that your sun sign is a Libra, then you'll be telling them in a social setting, you like people to be in harmony, you don't like conflict, and you are really good at bringing people together. Your sun sign is just one part of who you are, and all of us is a very complicated mix of all 12 signs. Okay, so knowing the sun sign is just the tip of the iceberg, and it doesn't really give the full picture of who you are as a human being. It's just a small picture. It's just the ego. And as yoga practitioners, we all know that the ego is, first of all, it's malleable. Second of all, it needs to be in check a little bit. That's what we learn in meditation. And third of all, the ego really isn't meant to drive the show because there's so much more. And for the most part, the moon actually does represent that so much more. The moon is behind the scenes, harboring our emotions, our experiences, our urges, our drives, and our memory. That's a big job for the moon. And frankly, it is all of those buried things within the unconscious that actually create the reactions of our ego, the sun. So the moon and the sun, they can't really be talked about separately. They are quite together and working together. And of course, there are huge implications for us who also practice yoga. The sun is our masculine energy, represented by the Pingala Nadi, the solar energetic channel that is beginning and ending on the right side of the body. And the moon is our feminine energy, represented by the Ida Nadi, beginning and ending on the left side of the body. So that is another lecture, but for those who follow along, or who even just kind of mildly follow along, remember that these planets, the sun and the moon, the masculine, the feminine, they are the positive, the negative, the top, the bottom, the opposites within us. And they're not opposites in such a way that they never attract. It's not like two magnets with the same poles that will never come together. These opposites are actually meant to work together. They don't necessarily do it on their own, okay? And they do come together a couple of times a year, astronomically speaking, which is also a huge astrological event. And another reason for me to talk about the planets with you today is that on Christmas, actually, on December 25th, for those of us in the North and South American continents, as well as that part of the Earth, we will be experiencing a solar eclipse. And I say that because the solar eclipse really actually happens on December 26th, but it's only going to be visible for the folks in like Indonesia. And at the time it will be visible for them, it will still be December 25th for us. And here in North America, we will not be able to see it. But just because we can't see it with our eyes doesn't mean we won't feel it with our hearts and our bodies, astrologically speaking. So it's really important that we know that these events are happening. And of course, eclipses kind of come together. So as we have a solar eclipse on December 25th, we will also have a lunar eclipse on January 10th. So this is a really good time to start paying attention to when the sun and the moon come together, because they're coming together for us twice over the next few weeks. And this is representative. So anytime something happens in the sky, it is reflective of what's happening within us. That's the dictum of the mystic, the most powerful statement ever made by the alchemist Hermes Trismegistus is as above, so below. This is our most powerful mystical statement. So anything that's happening in the sky, anything that's happening around us is reflective of our internal nature, what's happening on the inside. So when the sun and the moon truly come together to make this magnificent event, there's this transparency that is meant to occur between our light and our shadow. We're meant to be able to dredge up from these dark places, this vast, dark landscape, some kind of shining thing in order to bring it into the light. And truly, the location of our greatest gifts, our greatest gold, is within that shadow. It's within that moon element of our unconscious. Okay, so those are the luminaries. Moving on, let's go to Mercury. So Mercury loves data. Mercury is actually hermaphroditic. It is both masculine and feminine, which is very cool. We'll see that in the personal planets, there is a balance of masculine and feminine. Mercury kind of gives us that balance with the ability to be both masculine and feminine. The moon is feminine, the sun is masculine, and then Venus will be feminine and Mars will be masculine, just for, spoilers. But Mercury loves data and governs our communication. So remember, as humans, we all communicate. Some of us communicate really well. Some of us communicate really clearly. Some of us communicate really poorly. Some of us have difficulty communicating. It doesn't matter our ability. It just matters that we are communicating. This is a foundational quality. This is a foundational element to being human. And it is our ability to express who we are. And that's what Mercury does for us. The next personal planet is Venus, which is responsible for our self-love and acceptance. Or, if things aren't going well, our lack of self-love and acceptance. But again, as humans, we all have this, or we have a lack of it, but it is present and it is something that is needed. Venus embodies our sensuality, and I don't necessarily mean that in a sexual way. I actually mean that in terms of our actual senses: sight, smell, hearing, touch. Our ability to be a part of the world, to immerse ourselves in the world, the sense we have of our world and ourselves. This is where we get our love of nature, art, the feeling of being alive, those moments that James Joyce would so elegantly call aesthetic arrest, those moments where we find ourselves just taken by the beauty of something, or the grandeur of something, or the newness of something. That's completely Venusian. So Venus is responsible for this utterly human quality of love and acceptance and immersion in the world. Mars is responsible for making things happen and getting moving. So again, this is a very human quality, right? We may not move very much, perhaps we're fairly lethargic, but every morning, like it or not, we all have to get out of bed. And that getting moving, even if it's just the most minimal of efforts, which I get it, some days it's totally like that and we don't want to get out of bed, but the reality is eventually we do. So anytime we're moving our day onward, we're getting ready to go to work or to pick someone up or to clean the house, all of that is very Mars or Martian energy. So this is Mars' responsibility, and Mars is always acting and trying to get things done. Now, of course, that can be overdone and it can be overwhelming. We want Mars to act out of love and dignity rather than fear and force. So this is something to consider, especially as a mystic who's trying to work the practice and walk the walk. When we act, because we will act, and Mars is responsible for action, we want to do our best to act with love and dignity. And do our best to not act out of fear or force. We're not trying to, anytime we act out of fear, and I know that you will feel this, I feel this, it happens to all of us. We will all at some point act out of fear. It is inevitable. Again, we are human. But when we do, we'll actually feel it as a sensation in our body. We'll feel closed, we'll feel tight, we'll feel a sense of tension and an inability to speak. There'll be a funny feeling in our tummy, which makes sense because Mars is also the ruler of the third or solar plexus chakra. So when you get that gut feeling like, oof, I don't know if I should do this, then you know you're acting out of fear. Or if you're trying to pressure someone or force something to happen, that's also going to have a not great feeling associated with it. So since we have to act all day, that's actually one of the things we learn when we study the text, the Bhagavad Gita, is that action is unavoidable. So Mars is operating within all of us. If we are to act, which we are, because we are human, let's act out of love and dignity. So these are the personal planets: Venus, Mars, Mercury, the Sun, and the Moon. And they're operating within us at all times. This is really who we are, what makes us tick. And then we have two other planets that are really important for us to know in our personalities and day-to-day lives. These are called the social planets, and that's because they are the outer world having a direct influence upon us and around us. They are Saturn and Jupiter. So Jupiter is the influence of the world upon us and around us, encouraging us to grow, to explore, expand, to seek out new experiences and adventures. So if we think of the energy and the attitude of, say, the 2 and the 3-year-old who are putting things in their mouths, who are wandering around, exploring new parts of the house maybe they haven't seen yet, asking all sorts of questions, there's this deep human urge to grow, to learn, to experience, to live life. And that's very much Jupiter. So that exploration of the world and the world almost calling to us to be explored is that Jupiter influence. Saturn is the influence of our family and our ancestors upon us, reminding us of our responsibilities, our duty, what we need to survive, but also how we eventually leave an indelible legacy on the planet once we're gone. Saturn really represents our basic needs. Saturn's often called the bringer of karma. He has kind of a heavy-duty role in the sky, and he's not messing around. Saturn wants you to make things happen and get things done. It's like the father. Saturn's like the cosmic father. So if you feel his energy, you will be feeling that pressure to get things done. And it can be an overwhelming pressure when it goes bad. This idea that you have to honor your traditions, you have to honor your history, you have to do what your parents told you, you have to, I'm thinking of all the scripted things. These are all the shoulds that we grow up with in life. You should finish school, you should have this specific career, you should have this type of relationship. that's very much Saturnian. And it doesn't mean that we are beholden to it, and it doesn't mean that we have to actually do those things. We need to find our own way through those things. There is a way to honor family ancestors and our responsibilities that is still very true and authentic to us, and that really is what Saturn wants of us, and what Saturn wants us to do. So I've now taken us through 7 planets, and if you, like me, are yogically minded, you're thinking, wait, Alana, the number 7, I've heard that before. Every time I think of 7, I think of the chakras. Well, good on you. Then you have completely come to the right conclusion, because each one of these 7 planets is also correspondent with a chakra. Isn't that wild? It's like there are no accidents, right? The more that you study mysticism, spirituality, religions, belief systems, the more that you'll realize how incredibly the same they all are, and how many crossovers from one thing to the next we find. So the chakras do correspond with each of these planets, and I'll list them out in a moment. And I've actually got a lot more resources on this. I do put resources on this in my highereducation.yoga membership, which I invite you to join me on. You can continue this conversation and get your $1 trial at highereducation.yoga/trial. And I also talk about this, I believe, in my I know I talk about it in my alchemical astrology certification program, but I think also my chakra certification program. So there's lots more info. I'm going to go through it briefly, but Saturn, you might have guessed even as I was talking about it, like, wow, Mercury governs communication. That sounds like throat chakra. Yep, exactly. So Saturn governs the root chakra. Jupiter governs our sacral chakra, our relationships. Mars is the solar plexus. I did mention that earlier. Venus is easy to guess. That's the heart. Mercury is the throat. And in terms of the planets, the sun and the moon both occupy the third eye. And the crown is simply the universe, the all-expansive source, what we as astronomers might refer to as the cosmic background radiation, that overlying pulse vibration, it essentially blankets the entire universe. Yogis would call that vibration the sound of Om. Astronomers call it the background radiation, and the chakras would just call it the crown chakra. So no matter how you look at it, we have this incredible cosmic connection, but the sun and the moon both occupy the third eye, that is the realm of both consciousness and unconsciousness. Now, of course, if you're paying attention, there are 3 more planets: Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto. And they're called the transpersonal planets because they have a much broader and more ethereal hold on us. So they're not ancestral, they're not necessarily inside of our personality. A lot of the energies of these 3 planets have to do with the collective. So the collective consciousness, things that are bigger than just you and I alone. So the last 3 planets are Neptune, Uranus, and Pluto. Neptune governs our desires for transcendence. So Neptune is definitely our patron planet of yoga and mysticism. Neptune loves transcendence, anything that makes us feel transcendent, anything that allows us to dream, kind of float off into, daydreaming. That's very much Neptune's energy. This is how we tap into the collective. This is how we tap into greater knowledge, how we tap into our true source. Uranus seeks to inspire us and shake up the norm. So if you've ever gotten lightning bolts of inspiration, and I'm telling you, like, it comes from outside of you type of inspiration, not just you remembered something, but you suddenly have a flash of genius and you're like, oh my God, you never thought of that before. And in fact, it probably wasn't even you thinking of it. Something came from outside of you and was delivered, and that is Neptune. Uranus. Uranus wants us to think outside the box. Uranus wants us to shake things up, to destroy old ways of being and old ways of thinking. So Uranus energy actually can be very intense, especially when the shakeup is happening. Because if we're not ready for a new paradigm or to shift our paradigm, it can be a lot of suffering that's involved in that particular shakeup. And finally, we have Pluto. Yes, a planet. And Pluto very much is like Shiva, our great cosmic dancer who has no qualms destroying universes and rebuilding them from scratch. Not attached to one universe or another. Ideally, Pluto's energy is not attached as well. But because we're human and most of us are fairly attached, there can be some suffering that comes along with Pluto's energy because Pluto wants us to resurrect. Pluto wants us to die to our old selves and then be reborn again. And how perfect are we ending with this particular energy at this time of year? The date of this podcast's release, let's see, is December 23rd. So it's just 2 days after the winter solstice, our shortest day of the year, our longest night. And we're just moving into slightly longer days, but it's barely noticeable now. In a couple more days, in fact, on the day of the birth of the sun, S-O-N and S-U-N on Christmas, we finally get to really feel the fact that the days are starting to get longer, and that return of the sun is such an appropriate metaphor for Pluto's energy of death and resurrection. The darkness is our time to die. It's our time to let go. It's our time to go inward, to think about what we no longer need, what no longer serves us, to dive deeply within us, to remember what reactions and triggers we've had this year, and to actually go into them and see what might be revealed, what might be reborn out of that, what might we pull from that and shine up in the light as the light returns to us. Of course, we've got some more astrological and astronomical events happening to give more weight to this particular metaphor, especially with Pluto, asking us to make big changes. And that is, of course, our solar eclipse on Christmas Day, the 25th. Or for those in the region of, I guess, Indonesia, it will be on the 26th. And then we have a lunar eclipse on January 10th with I believe, the full moon. So this is all really it's all happening. And the thing that I want to leave you with in this podcast is that it's always happening. And very few people anymore pay attention to these things happening. Very few people will notice a new or a full moon. Very few people will celebrate and honor a solstice. Very few people will do anything but just look at an eclipse. Very few people will feel that energy, will live with that energy. But I want to remind you that human beings have been living and working with these cosmic energies for thousands upon thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years. Our initial mythologies, our initial spiritualities, the initial belief systems of all human beings were all based on the sun and the moon. They were all based around the stars. That is what brings us together. That's what's marked our days. That's what's marked our years. That's when we've determined that, we are 1 year older to have life transitions, communal transitions. Holidays are marked by various astronomical events. It is our sky that has determined our lives as human beings on this planet. And for us to not at least pay some attention to these planets and give them some weight in our lives is really a mistake, especially for those of us who are mystics, who seek to be mystics, and particularly for those of us who look to step into our role as a spiritual leader. We need to bring people back to this communal energy, this space where we honor the sky once more. People used to live with the rhythms of the moon. In fact, many women's bodies still live with the rhythms of the moon, even if those women themselves are not conscious of what the moon is doing. So these planets, these beautiful planets whose archetypal energies live and breathe and thrive within us, have relevance to us as modern day people. And I hope that this overview has given you some cause and reason to take a good look at the planets once again, or to look at them for the first time. And regardless, I hope that you all have an opportunity to now see the planet with new, more mystical eyes. I wish you all the happiest of New Year's, and I look forward to continuing this journey with you in the next year. And remember, if you want to continue this conversation and learn more about mysticism and spiritual leadership, go ahead and join me in the highereducation.yoga membership. And again, your $1 trial is available at highereducation.yoga/trial. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave me a review in iTunes or wherever you downloaded this podcast from. Not only is that incredibly heartwarming and I love it, but it's also the best way to help others find this podcast. And of course, we need more people like us helping to do this good work in the world right now. You are being called to do it, and it is my honor to help you step into your role as a spiritual leader. Until next time, namaste.